In the summer of 1976, I said goodbye to my mom, who never took her eyes off the magazine she was reading. She simply gave a curt wave that said, "You don't have to be home by dinner, but be safe and have fun." Then I walked out the front door and hopped into the passenger seat of the red Challenger that belonged to my best friend, Jonathan Belvedere. 10 minutes later, Jonathan parked his Challenger outside the home of Rachel Lafferty, our other good friend, and seconds later, Rachel was getting into the back seat, a huge grin on her face. But there was a hint of sadness in that grin, like a rose that was starting to wilt just slightly. Then, turning to both Rachel and I, Jonathan perfectly summed up why that sad smile was there. "Well, boys and girls, it's the final summer," Jonathan said sagely. "One last hurrah for the Three Musketeers." "Don't say that," Rachel said, and now she really did look sad. "It's not the end. It's a new beginning," I added, giving them both a weak smile. "Sure," Jonathan said, winking at us both and putting the Challenger in drive. "To new beginnings." And then his Challenger sped off down the road on that bright summer day, loud and powerful, no doubt giving some of Rachel's neighbors alarm. In fact, one of Rachel's neighbors, who was mowing his lawn, shouted at us to slow down as we flew by. Everyone in town knew Jonathan's car. It was instantly recognizable due to the yellow smiley face he had painted on the driver door. We had all just graduated high school, and this was the last summer before we each went our separate ways. Rachel would be attending the University of Madison in the fall. I would be attending the less prestigious technical college, but my parents were still proud that I was going to college anyways. Jonathan wasn't attending college at all. He was going to move to Milwaukee to work at an auto shop his uncle owned. None of us would ever end up doing those things. But as Jonathan's Challenger bore us out of the suburbs like a bat out of hell, we didn't know that. We knew that the times were changing, to be sure, and that the Three Musketeers were splitting up. But there must be still some good times ahead. But there must still be good times ahead, right? And on that bright summer day, it was easy to believe that. Easy to believe in new beginnings. We lived in Dutchville, Wisconsin. If you were to visit Dutchville today, you'd find a thriving town that has all the hustle and bustle that comes along with strip malls and movie theaters that bring food right over to your seat. And there are apartment complexes everywhere. But back in the 70s, I'm not sure you could even quite call Dutchville a town. More of a hodgepodge of small suburbs, one school, and one downtown area. And when you left all that behind, there was nothing but farms, fields, and roads. So many roads. An intricate web of roads that sprawled all across the county. It was through that web of roads that we drove, blasting music in Jonathan's car and laughing. The plan was simple. We would drive around for a bit, then find a spot to hang. But for how long did we drive? 20 minutes? 30? 45? An hour? I honestly couldn't say. Time seemed to move strange that day. I can only say that after an indeterminate amount of time, Jonathan slowed his car down. To our right was an old-looking gravel road. There was a frail-looking wooden street sign at its beginning. Written over the wood in crude black letters were the words, "Sparrow Road." "Sparrow Road," Jonathan said, bemused. "I don't think I've ever been down this road before." "Me neither," I said, which was strange considering that ever since Jonathan got his license a few years back, we had spent countless weekends driving around our small town. To discover a new road wasn't just bizarre, it was plain eerie. But Jonathan, who now had a look in his eyes that was not unlike some great explorer who had just discovered a hidden Aztec city, turned the steering wheel, and the car lurched over the gravel road. The gravel made a terrible crunching noise underneath the tires. "Maybe we shouldn't," Rachel said from the back seat. "I got a funny feeling about this." Rachel's funny feelings were not to be taken lightly. Once in 8th grade, we had discovered a fairly big tree in the woods outside of town, the kind of tree that was perfect for climbing. Jonathan and I began climbing the tree, but Rachel said that we shouldn't, that she just had a funny feeling was all. She got really scared, and so Jonathan and I stopped climbing and left the woods with her. Not 30 minutes later, a surprise storm came over the town. When we went into the woods the next day, the tree we had been climbing had been struck down by lightning. The tree, which had seemed so large and ancient the day before, had now been reduced to blackened wood. and had we not listened to Rachel that day, Jonathan and I might have burned along with it. There were other moments since then, smaller moments, but moments where Rachel's funny feeling came in handy. Maybe Rachel's right, I said. It's fine, Padre, Jonathan said, choosing to ignore Rachel's warning. He occasionally liked to call me Padre because one time in 7th grade I jokingly said I wanted to become a priest. The car began to pick up speed. What better way to spend the final summer than explore some strange roads, eh? We'll just cruise for a little bit and then find a place to hang. Rachel said nothing, but when I turned to look at her, she had a worried look on her face. I don't know how long we cruised down that terrible gravel road. I only know that the sound of the gravel crunching underneath the Challenger's tires seemed to grow louder and louder the more we went along, and Sparrow Road seemed to stretch on for an eternity. At one point, we came across an abandoned car. Looks old, Rachel said as we passed it. That was an understatement. The car looked ancient, like something from the early 1900s. Groovy, Jonathan said. He whistled and kept driving. But eventually, Jonathan did bring the car to a stop. On our right was nothing but a field of green grass. On our left was the same, except jutting out of the grass, just a few feet from the road, was a stone well. This looks like as good a spot as any, Jonathan said, turning off the car. We gathered up our goods, that is, the beer Jonathan had stored in the car, and got out. The stone well had a small roof over it, and just a little bit below the roof was a bar looped with rope. On the bar's right end was a wheel crank that, when turned, would ease the rope down into the well. Sitting on top of the well's roof was a big black crow that cawed as we approached. Jonathan shooed it, but it only flew a few feet away and regarded us reproachfully with its head cocked to the side. The three of us looked down into the well. The mouth of the well was wide, very, very wide. I'll never forget the shivers that went up my back as we looked into it. You couldn't see the bottom of the well. The stone walls seemed to go down for a few feet, and then there was nothing but blackness stretching into infinity. No sign of any water either. No plausible way to tell how deep it went, not with your eyes at least. And there was something terrible about that darkness. You stared down into the well, and the well seemed to stare back. "Hello!" Jonathan yelled into the darkness, and his voice echoed, and then faded. "Trippy stuff," Jonathan said, grinning. "Creepy," Rachel said. "You can't see the bottom." It's just a trick of the light," Jonathan said. Then, turning away from the well, he took 3 beers out of his bag and handed one to both Rachel and I. We toasted, and we drank. "What road were we on?" Rachel said sometime later. "Huh?" Jonathan replied. He was sitting on the lip of the well, smoking a cigarette. Rachel and I were sitting in the grass. There were crumpled beer cans all around us. "Before we came onto Sparrow Road, what road were we on?" "Oh," Jonathan said. The end of his cigarette was beginning to droop lamely, and he ashed it into the well. "I don't remember." "Do you remember?" Rachel said, looking at me. I shook my head. I tried to think, but I honestly couldn't remember. "Neither can I," Rachel continued. And now she sounded as worried as she looked. "I don't know where we are right now. I don't like being here." "We're on Sparrow Road," Jonathan said flatly. "But where is Sparrow Road?" Rachel responded. "Jesus, Rachel," Jonathan said, spreading his hands out. "It's somewhere in Dutchville County, obviously." "Maybe Rachel's right," I said. "Maybe we should head back. Remember the tree? Don't give me the tree thing again," Jonathan said. And he threw his entire cigarette into the well. "I know you guys must think you're so much smarter than me because you got into college and all." "Jonathan, that's not at all," Rachel tried to say, but was cut off. "But I'm not as dumb as you might think, Rachel Lafferty. And if I am, then who better to recognize dumb luck than a dummy himself? Because that tree thing, that was pure dumb luck. And you've been holding that over our heads for too fucking long. And I do remember what road we were on. We were on Mulberry. And then we turned on to Sparrow Road." But he didn't sound as if he believed it. And the 3 of us had driven down Mulberry Road multiple times. There had never been a gravel road that went off Mulberry. A terrible silence overtook the 3 of us. It was broken when Jonathan began laughing. I'm sorry, guys, Jonathan said. I'm being a grade A asshole right now. Kinda have been the whole drive, Rachel said, but not unkindly, and she was smiling. Some start for the final summer, huh? Jonathan said, meeting her smile. And then the three of us started laughing. It was the last good laugh I remember having. Then, after our laughter subsided, Jonathan said, "You're right, though. This place is creepy. Let's head back." "Really?" Rachel said. "Really," Jonathan replied. Memories are a funny thing. I've played back what happens next in my head multiple times. Played it over and over again. Sometimes that stupid crow is back on the roof of the well, and when it caws, it surprises Jonathan. Other times the crow isn't there at all. But regardless of the variations in my memory, the result is always the same. Rachel and I stand up in the grass, and as Jonathan gets up from the lip of the stone well, he loses his balance. His hand slips as he tries to grab the well. He falls backwards. He falls into the well. Jonathan didn't scream as he fell backwards. He simply made a short gasping noise. The back of his head hit the rope bar, and then he fell down into the gaping maw of the well. Rachel and I immediately rushed to the well and looked down. There was no sign of Jonathan. There was one horrible moment where Rachel and I didn't say anything. I think because morbidly, we were both waiting for the sound of him hitting the bottom of the well. But no sound ever came. And then Rachel and I began screaming. We began screaming Jonathan's name, begging him to answer us. But there was no reply. Only darkness stared up at us. "We need to get help," I said. And then a sick realization came over me. Oh, Jesus, Rachel, Jonathan had the keys. I stared over at Jonathan's Challenger. The yellow smiley face on the driver door seemed to stare back at me mockingly. "I'll run," I said. "I'll run as fast as I can to town, and I'll get help." I was already beginning to move. "Wait," Rachel said. "Just wait." She walked over to the wheel crank and began to turn it. Rope began to pull down. "What are you doing?" I asked, mortified as Rachel began to tie the rope around her waist. "Do you remember my cousin Anton?" Rachel asked. Vaguely," I said. "Look, Rachel. I went to visit Anton a couple of summers ago. My uncle has a farm, and they have a ground well just like this on their land. Anton, he's a couple of years younger than us, and he's not that bright. He fell into the well. I was the one that found him because I heard him screaming. My uncle told my aunt to go get help, but do you know what my uncle did? He went down into the well. He stayed down there with Anton for hours. Later that night, he told me that getting a person out of a well isn't the tricky part. It's making sure they're still alive when you bring them up that's hard. Do you understand? Bringing Anton up wasn't the priority. Stopping the bleeding was. Jonathan is down there. And he's probably bleeding. We can't just leave him down there. And I think we're far. Very, very far from Dutchville, or from anyone. It'll take a long time to run and get help. If we both run, then there might not be a Jonathan to bring up by the time we get back with help. So before you leave, you're going to lower me down that well, and I'm going to help Jonathan because he's probably unconscious down there, and he's probably bleeding." "Jesus Christ, Rachel, you want to go down there?" "It's not that deep," Rachel said, staring down the well. She sounded as if she was talking more to herself than me. "It's just a trick of the light. Wells are never that deep. The one Anton fell into wasn't that deep." Rachel didn't mention that she'd probably been able to see Anton at the bottom of the well he had fallen into. There was no seeing the bottom of this well. Someone has to stop the bleeding. Rachel had swung both her legs over the well and was now dangling over the darkness. In some ways, she looked like bait that was about to be swallowed up by a great white shark. Or, in this case, a great stone worm. "Are you sure about this?" I asked nervously. Rachel nodded. "The moment I reach the bottom, you run and get help." I put both hands on the crank wheel and began to turn. Rachel began to lower into the well. After a moment, her feet dipped into the darkness. For some odd reason, I expected her to make some kind of noise, like a person makes when they first step into a cold pool, but Rachel said nothing. A moment later, her legs were swallowed by the darkness. Then her torso. Rachel stared up at me with those bright blue eyes of hers, and then those too went into the darkness. Just a trick of the light. I stopped the crank for a moment and yelled down the well, "Rachel, are you okay?" Not being able to see her made me feel so frightened. I immediately regretted lowering her down and was about to bring the rope up. "I'm okay," Rachel responded, but her voice sounded so far away, as if she was at the end of a very long tunnel, which didn't seem right at all, considering I had only lowered her a few feet into the well. "Keep going." I continued to turn the crank. Deeper and deeper Rachel went into the well. Though I couldn't see it, I could only watch as the rope pulled down from the bar. "I still haven't reached the bottom yet," Rachel called up. At least, this is what I thought I heard. It was incredibly hard to hear her now. She sounded so far. "Wait, hold on, there's..." "Rachel?" I yelled down the well. "What is it?" There came no reply except for my own echo. "Rachel? Rachel, if you don't respond, I'm bringing you back up." Not being able to stand Rachel's silence and the horrible sound of my own echo, I immediately began to reverse steer the crank and pull the rope up. The moment I did, I could tell something was wrong. The rope felt much lighter than it should have. I turned the wheel like a madman. I could already feel my fingers starting to blister, and then the end of the rope receded out of the darkness and into the light of the day. It was no longer tied around Rachel. It was not tied around anything, and Rachel was nowhere to be seen. I stared numbly at the end of the rope, which now looked frayed, as if it had been cut or chewed by something. I looked down the well, and that terrible, empty darkness stared back. At some point, Rachel had become untied and fell further into the well, but like Jonathan, there came no sound of her hitting the bottom, if there even was a bottom. I screamed down the well. I screamed for both Rachel and Jonathan, but again I was only met with the sound of my own echo. For one insane moment, I thought of lowering the length of the entire rope into the well and then climbing down it like some kind of firefighter. But the thought disappeared as I stared down into the darkness. It was replaced by another thought. I could feel a strange pulling sensation in the back of my head, and as I stared down the well, it was almost as if the darkness was slowly rising to meet me. "Just fall in," the thought in the back of my head said. It spoke in a clear voice, almost too clear to be only a thought. "Just fall in and ride the endless well. Jonathan and Rachel are down here. They're falling. They'll always be falling." Higher and higher the darkness climbed. I continued to stare down at it, as if in a trance. I could feel myself leaning over the lip of the well, leaning further and further in. Just fall. 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 I was so close to falling in when I heard the sound of a crow cawing. It broke the trance. I immediately became aware of how far I was leaning over the well and backed away. The crow, and it was undoubtedly the same crow we saw when we first came to the well, continued to caw. It sounded like laughter, malicious laughter. That was enough. I ran away screaming. I ran for what felt like an endless amount of time. At some point, though, I did reach the end of the gravel road. I continued to run, searching for help, screaming for it. Nothing around me looked familiar at all, and there wasn't a soul in sight. The roads were completely empty. I think we're far, very, very far from Dutchville, or from anyone. We had left my home around 9:45 a.m. It had been a bright, beautiful summer day. When I finally stumbled across the diner, it was pitch black outside. When I first saw the diner, I wasn't sure if it was real. I had the same feeling that a man who had been roaming the desert might feel when suddenly coming across a beautiful oasis. Was it some terrible trick, a cruel mirage? I had been running around empty roads for who knows how long, and now suddenly here was a bit of civilization. The diner had a bright red neon sign on top of it that read, "Shelley's Diner." It hurt my eyes, but I could smell coffee coming from inside, and that was a good smell. As I shuffled to the diner's entrance, I noticed the handful of cars in the parking lot. They each had Kansas license plates. I walked through the diner's front door like a corpse. "I'll be with you in 1 second, sweetheart," the waitress was saying, and then she stopped when she saw me stumble through the door. I imagine I looked like a corpse as well. "Please help us," I said. My voice felt weak. Tears were streaking down my cheeks. There were only a handful of patrons in the diner, and they all turned to look at me. "My friends need help. God, please help us." I was in Short Falls, Kansas. That is what the waitress told me when I asked her where I was. I had been in Dutchville, Wisconsin in the morning, and now I was in a small county that was at least 12 hours away. Impossible, of course. There was no way we had driven that far, or in that direction. There was no way any of this could be real. But the diner was real. The coffee the waitress had given me was real too. And so were those license plates outside. I told my story to the patrons, and they listened with rapt attention. When I finished, a small murmur broke out in the diner. I could tell by the look in their eyes that none of them believed me. They regarded me the same way one might regard a sick dog. "Son, I've lived here my whole life," an older man said. "I've never once seen any Sparrow Road." Another murmur, this one of agreement, broke out in the diner. "I don't care if you believe me. Please, just help my friends." There had been a search. The waitress had called the Short Falls Sheriff Department, and they listened to my story, and when I was finished, they looked at me the same way the patrons in the diner had. But they did their due diligence, and they had even called the station in Dutchville. And when they realized that I was telling the truth and that I was from Wisconsin, that did raise their eyebrows. And when I called my mom and they listened to me cry on the phone with her, that did more than raise their eyebrows. It caused their faces to turn white. I stopped looking so much like a sick dog to them. So there had been a search, and a collaboration between the Short Falls Sheriff Department and the Dutchville Sheriff Department was formed. And I had even ridden in the passenger seat with the sheriff, trying my best to guide him and backtrack my steps to that terrible gravel road. We drove around that small Kansas county for hours. None of the roads we drove on looked anything like the roads I had seen earlier. These roads were normal roads. They had normal traffic and streetlights. But those other roads I had traveled when I fled from Sparrow Road, those had been deserted roads, quiet roads. Eventually, Jonathan and Rachel's parents both came out to Short Falls to help look, and that had been hard to face them, but they had never blamed me, had never once questioned the validity of my story. That had been nice of them. Yes, there had been a search. More than one, actually, but it all seemed to blur into one long, hopeless endeavor. And despite how long we looked, we never found any Sparrow Road. Not in Short Falls, Kansas, or Dutchville, Wisconsin. Jonathan and Rachel were officially designated by the state as missing. My story was eventually disregarded as more plausible theories came to light. Theories that the state was more willing to accept. I had suffered some kind of heat stroke, according to the medical experts that had examined me after. We had gone riding. Maybe there had been a crash, or maybe they had ditched me. Either way, I had gotten separated from the car, and I had suffered a heat stroke, and ended up all the way in Short Falls, Kansas. Sure. And now my two best friends were simply missing. Falling. Not missing. Falling. I did find the well again, however, some years later. Never went to college, technical or otherwise. My parents understood. Even if their sloped shoulders told me that they wished I would give it, what's the saying? The old college try. They understood my depression. Although we never called it that and spent most of our time talking around it. And so instead of going to college in Madison, I hung around Dutchville, doing odd-end jobs here and there. And of course I would always keep my eyes open for an old gravel road. Sometimes I swear I would see it, only to blink and it would be gone. It was 3 years later when I found the well again. I was sitting on the back porch of my parents' house, nursing a glass of whiskey. I'd actually put off drinking since that horrible day in '76. Despite my depression, I had never really felt the urge to drink. I'd felt the opposite, in fact. In my head, I always saw those crumpled beer cans around the well. That had been enough to put off drinking. For a time. But that night in '79 was significant because we were coming up on the 3-year anniversary of Jonathan and Rachel's disappearance, and the urge to ease that pain took over. So I took my father's bottle of whiskey to the back porch and began to drink. When I felt that malty drink go down my throat, I realized something. I didn't have to look for Sparrow Road or the well anymore, because the well was inside me, and it was deep. I thought that if I drank enough, if I filled the well enough, maybe Rachel and Jonathan would come rising to the top, rising like a geyser and then come spilling out of my mouth, just as young as the day they disappeared. It had to be true, because the idea of them falling down an endless tunnel for all eternity was too much to bear. I'll always be falling. And so I drank. I filled the well. A couple years later, I had been in a bar, filling the well, when a man in a trucker's hat walked in. The bar owner was upset at the man because he had been late on delivering something to the bar. He was at least a day late on his order. The trucker explained he had gotten turned around on his way. "I'm sorry, Sam," the trucker had said to the bar owner. "You know it's not like me to be late. I'm always on time. But I just got turned around. End up on some shit gravel road and took me a while to find my way. Strangest thing. Bunch of abandoned cars on that road." "What road?" I had grabbed the man on the shoulder and he jerked around in surprise. He and the bar owner looked at me just like those diner patrons in Short Falls had all those years ago. "Fella, would you mind letting go of my shoulder?" the trucker asked. I tightened my grip. "What was the name of the road?" "I'm not sure. I don't remember." Was it Sparrow? Was it Sparrow Road?" I could feel my eyes bulging in their sockets. The bar owner tried to peel me off the trucker, but the harder he pulled, the more I stuck. "Hey, buddy, ease off." "You said you saw the cars," I said, shaking the trucker now violently. "Did you see a red one? A Challenger?" Bright recognition appeared in the trucker's eyes. I stopped shaking him. "I did," the trucker said. "At least I think I did. It was a red Challenger. It had a faded yellow smiley face painted on the driver door." I screamed. I passed out. I woke up in the drunk tank. When I got out and headed back to the bar, the owner refused to let me enter. He told me if I kept coming back and bothering his people, he would stop calling the police. He would take care of me his way. I never saw that trucker again. On November 13th, 1999, I saw Rachel Lafferty. I was in a bar in Madison, doing what I do best, filling the well. I had gotten exceptionally good at filling the well by this point. If there was a Hall of Fame for filling the well, I was no doubt a first ballot entry. The Badgers were on TV playing Iowa, and it was the end of the third quarter. The Badgers had started a recent tradition where the third and fourth quarter, the stadium would play Jump Around by House of Pain. Everyone in the stands would, you guessed it, start jumping around. They were starting that now. The camera was zooming in on one section of the stadium, highlighting the students jumping for joy. What I saw almost caused me to spill my drink. Almost, but not quite, because a spilled drink can't be used to fill the well. Rachel Lafferty was standing in the very center of the section. Unlike the other students around her, who were all wearing red, Rachel was still wearing the faded blue shirt and blue jeans she had worn that day, and there was a piece of frayed rope tied around her waist. None of the other students seemed to notice her. She wasn't jumping. She was staring right at the camera, right at me. She was mouthing something. "You'll always be falling." "Could you turn that off?" I asked the bartender, turning away from the television. "It's the Big Ten championship, asshole," the bartender responded, and then he went back to ignoring me. I finished my drink. Always made sure I finished my drink. And then I got up and left the bar. As I was walking out, Rachel was still on the television, mouthing words silently, and her eyes followed me the way a portrait does. "Come fall with us." A couple of years ago, I had been in a Barnes & Noble, perusing their music section. People were giving me the side eye, no doubt because of the way I was staggering around. I had been filling the well early that morning. I was flipping through their vinyl section when goosebumps ran up the back of my neck. When I looked up, Jonathan Belvedere was standing on the other side of the rack. He looked exactly the same as he did that day in '76. Same blue denim jacket, same blue jeans, same yellow t-shirt. He was fingering through the records casually, as if he hadn't been missing for 40-plus years. "Some choice tunes here, Padre," Jonathan said. "Good songs to fall to." Then Jonathan began coughing and made a terrible noise like a cat about to spit out a hairball. It also faintly reminded me of old gravel crunching under tires. Then he did spit something out. It floated and landed on my hand. It was a black crow's feather. I ran from the store. I have not seen Rachel or Jonathan since either of those occasions. I took a break from filling the well in order to write this, but already I can feel it calling me back. No matter how much I drink, it never fills all the way. But it needs to be filled, and I will keep trying. After all, just like Rachel had said all those years ago, wells are not that deep, right?